me all the time. He knows what I'm saying, but I'm pronouncing it wrong.
The Zhangshan Yanju is the name of a whole corpus of teachings that in the Bonpo tradition, and Dzogchen and their version of Dzogchen is incorporated in that.
So
But
more inclusive of
yeah, the Nyenju includes it's basically it's like the canon of their official teachings. It's like the Bonpo platform. Zhangzheng is where it came from. Zhangzheng is basically it's a mythical kingdom that was to the west of Tibet, which is supposedly where it is. Huh? Well, it's something. I don't know. I don't know that it's been historically located or whether it's historical or mythical or whatever. But
I don't know how to pronounce those words. Say them again. Shanshan.
Nyenju.
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 Nyenju. Shanshan Nyenju.
It seems to me that the Dzogchen versions are a little more structured.
The Dzogchen which?
The Dzogchen versions are a little more structured than the Bon traditions. I mean,
You mean like the Nyingma Dzogchen?
yes.
Yeah, they are. Bonpo Dzogchen is, in my opinion, a little purer and a little less tainted with sort of a tantric approach, and as a result, I don't know if it's as a result, but the Nyingma stuff is a lot more hierarchical and structured, and whereas the Bonpo is a lot more of a confluence, where they don't bother. For example, in Bonpo formula, they don't differentiate between Trekto and Togel so much as the Nyingma do. The Nyingma have that as like really extreme differentiation. The Bonpo, a little looser. The Bonpo teachings I've found seem to be very, very direct, very focused. It's a lot like the early Dzogchen teachings are like that too. If you look at the earliest Dzogchen texts, the earliest Dzogchen tantras, they're very, very pure. They're very direct. They're a lot like the things you find in some of the Bonpo stuff, and they are absolutely stripped naked. They're devoid of any structurality at all, which is so it's really pure Dzogchen. So it comes from that, and then there was apparently subsequent elaborations historically over the centuries. I think the development of Dzogchen and of all of the teachings in Tibet have been intermixed with politics, because it's all about, power structures and getting the teachings to fit in and keeping things from being heretical and keeping from ruffling someone's feathers and stuff. So, there's been a lot of controversy over the years. A lot of different factions have considered Dzogchen not actually Buddhism and a heresy, and there's been patched on, and there's been major schisms and assassinations and political chicanery and all this, all oriented around these kinds of issues. So I think a lot of the treatment of it has been to ameliorate some of that, or to somehow address some of that in various ways. But I mean, this is just my sense. I don't really know.
Were the Bonpo ones as strictly restricted as the Nyingma?
I think so.
Yeah.
I don't really know. I think the Bonpo, it's hard to know what it was like in the past. These days, the Bonpos look almost like Nyingmas in terms of their behavior and their dress and the monasteries and the whole deal. I mean, I don't know about these days, but in Tibet towards the end of the Tibetan Tibet, they were virtually indistinguishable. They just used different terms and different ceremonies, and one of them circumnavigated Mount Kailash clockwise, and the Bonpos did it counterclockwise or something. I mean, this is sort of different traditions, basically, but they were very similar in their structure. But they were all enmeshed in this tiny little isolated kingdom, so it's sort of a little melting pot, and so they were all bouncing off each other. It's no surprise.
But the important part, which is how you relate with your mind, how you come to know your mind, is that similar?
Oh, they're identical. The essence of Dzogchen is the Dzogchen view, and what they call the Dzogchen view, which is basically which is what Dzogchen is. Dzogchen is the Dzogchen view, and the Dzogchen view is that this condition is intrinsically transcendental, and all of its elaborations and presentations do not depart from that root transcendental condition, just occur within it as a natural efflorescence of what it is. That's the essence of the Dzogchen view. Just that one fact, the fact that this is unfindable, astounding, and what it is intrinsically is doing anything that seems to be happening without departing from itself, and doing it intrinsically within itself because of its nature without anything particular being done. In other words, it never departs from its root transcendental condition. That's the essence of Dzogchen view. And then the practice of Dzogchen is to see that as it is and rest in it.
I seem to get the idea that you're pointing to the mind. I mean, if you notice the mind before a thought occurs and after it leaves, then it's just a state where it's untainted by thought. I mean, it's
well, these are, but it's not so much tainted by thought or untainted by thought, although they refer to that. These are tricks to explore, to get to notice what this root condition is. And if you notice, so for example, notice the way anything appears, the way anything disappears, where it comes from, where it goes to, where it is while it is seemingly here, whatever that means. You discover the dynamism of this, and you discover that, wow, the way things happen is really strange. And then you get that strangeness is the root condition. That strangeness is what this is. And you can call it mind, you can call it, thought-free state, you can call it all these things, but those are really just experiments to discover this primal condition. In Dzogchen they call it the ground condition, or the Dharmakaya, which is just the root condition of pure being. And everything appears mysteriously and miraculously and spontaneously within the root condition of pure being, never departs from pure being and disappears within to pure being without anything actually having happened, because nothing was actually produced. It's like in a dream. A dream can have all sorts of events, but nothing is actually produced. The dream was never produced. It was just apparent. But there was never a time when the dream was taken and put somewhere and all of a sudden something has been created. Because nothing has been created because you can't find the dream. It's not anything. It just seems to be something. And likewise, if you look at any phenomena, like you look at the way the thought stream happens and thoughts appear and disappear within mind, or a sensory experience, the way you see something, you've never seen it before. Where was it before you saw it, and what's it like when it comes into experience and it instantaneously vanishes or morphs or becomes something else seemingly? Where did it go? How does all of that work? And again, the point isn't to pin that down. Because the point is to discover that you can't pin that down because nothing's actually happening. In other words, even though it seems to be a certain way, it isn't actually that way. It's intrinsically transcendent and cannot be found, cannot be isolated, cannot be pinned down or defined. And that is the root condition. And all these various tricks, working with mind, working with thoughts and all that, are just kind of experiments to explore noticing or coming upon or just discovering the way this actually works. But it's very, very simple. It's all just about the way experience works. Experience very mysteriously appears and disappears in real time from nowhere. And while it's appearing, it seems to be all of this definition and all this specificity, but you go try and find it, you can't actually find it or pin it down, and it's already gone by the time you get to it. And so the whole thing is kind of like a mirage, where it's very apparent, but if you start looking closer, it doesn't really it's not as substantial as it looks, and it's not as stable or what do they call it? Permanent as it seems to be. Everything is gone already. As soon as you look at any condition, it's already gone, and so on and so forth. And the trick is to notice that as it is, not philosophically or descriptively, but to be with the phenomena and discover this actual condition, that this is an actuality, this is an actual condition. And to find yourself, to first of all notice what it is, discover that there is nothing but this condition, and discover that you are this condition, everything is this condition, and it continues doing its thing, being itself eternally. And the practice is thereafter you rest in that, as if there was an alternative. That's really the totality of Dzogchen, and it's very simple to predicated upon if you can notice the natural condition as it is. If you find it challenging or difficult to notice a natural condition, then it can be very difficult. But other than that, it's effortless, absolutely effortless and easy. So the only challenge is having the wherewithal to notice what this primal condition is. And so the challenge in Dzogchen is generally what they call pointing out, which is, walking a person through various techniques and experiments to examine this present experience and notice the way it actually is working.
It seems to me a key feature of this is the recognition that the actual source of that is you. I mean, it's not like something out there.
Yeah, sure.
Is coming in.
Yeah, it's not you and it's not you, but it's not out there.
Right, it's not out there. It's
yeah.
The whole
the source of it is intrinsically transcendental, and you are intrinsically transcendental. So to say it's you supposes that there's a you that, for that to be meaningful, there would have to be a you that you could actually find, but there isn't, because you is a euphemism for something that is completely mysterious and miraculous and unfindable. So, that's the root. In Buddhism they use this wonderful word emptiness, which is very nice, but it can be a little elusive and a little abstract. But, it's experientially, its prime quality could be called unfindability. You can't find it. It's right here, but you can't find it. It's like try and find what this is. You can't find it. So it's completely evident, self-evident. It never goes away, but you can't find it, which is a very strange state of affairs. And so what this is very strange. It's intrinsically miraculous. So I like this word transcendental or transcendent, in the sense that it transcends any simple condition or definability or explainability or even indicatability. You can't even indicate it. Even though it's everywhere, you can't point to it. So it's that which is to me the word transcendental kind of indicates that rather nicely. But again, talking about it in those terms makes it sound very, very elusive and mysterious, and it is elusive and mysterious in one sense, but in another sense, it's just completely obvious. It's just this condition, and this condition is very weird. It's very non-linear. It's not simplistic or mechanical, or it's more like a dream.
Essentially, what Irma was saying, though, is true. Since words are inadequate anyway, is the idea that to look for it somewhere outside of your experience is erroneous, because you're not going to find it.
Yeah,
so
and you're not going to find it within
your experience.
Yeah. Yes, that's true, but you're not going to find it an inside either. That's
no, but that's.
Well, I noticed a very subtle shift. That it was like revealing the fact that on some level I have been looking for something out there.
Yeah.
And when I was reading that, like the source of all of this is you.
Yes.
It just shifted everything, and I know the you is tricky, but still it does create a whole different perspective shift.
Yeah. It's all a matter of countering misunderstandings.
Yeah.
When you take away all misunderstandings, what's left is actuality. And one of the prime misunderstandings is, of course, an unconscious belief in objectivity. The world is real, the world is objective, everything comes from the world, everything's based in the world, and the world is out there. And it's more real and more permanent and more long-lasting and so on than me. But that is essentially a belief. It's i.e. a fantasy. It exists only in imagination, because experientially that's unverifiable. And when you let go of that notion and stop unconsciously looking for the authority outside, just assume this experience itself is its own authority, that it bootstraps itself up out of itself, which is very true, and that's a good way to look at it. But then the next bastion is once you get that it's coming from you, then try and find this you and discover you is just as much of a myth as the outer world. And then where does it come from? Well, it doesn't come from anywhere, it comes from itself, which is a very strange state of affairs, but fairly accurate. But by all means, it's good to pop the balloon that that the objective world is the canon of actuality, for sure.
Seems to be an element of fear in that, or an element of queasiness.
Well, we're conditioned to cling to definition. We're conditioned to define ourselves, to define our world, and to orient towards that as being safe, as being, a kind of a successful strategy for concealment or hiding, or it's a good defensive strategy. And so if you challenge that or tamper with that, it can be threatening, because you're threatening that which you've been kind of unconsciously relying upon for your security in a way. But of course you've been relying on a fantasy for security, so you're not actually threatening anything. And when you see that, then obviously the sense of being threatened dissipates, because there's nothing actually there. Once you see all this defining is actually just bootstrapped up out of nothing. It's not actual. It's just a big elaborate, way, sort of an apologistic scheme or an explanatory scheme. Then you get that there's nothing there. There's nothing there that's going to be of any support. So why? So there's nothing being threatened by abandoning it. There's nothing there that's actually of any advantage.
It's kind of the same thing as the fear of aloneness in discovering this.
Yeah, all that.
Because there's a notion that there's safety in numbers, and so to sort of recognize that it's,
So the last time I saw you, we were talking about being in that state, that ground state. And I said that when it seems to me that when you're in the ground state, then the universe shows up for you. And because that's what I started to notice. And then over this last week, I've gone back through my life, and I've noticed just a number of events where I got a wake-up call. And in some instances I responded to it, other instances I didn't at all, much to my misfortune. And in some instances I had no choice. And I look back on it, and there was nothing that I could do that I wanted to do. The universe had its own plan or intelligence for me. And I remember there was a time I remember going to my mother and just saying, I don't understand this. So I guess I wanted to talk a little bit more about I mean, how that's working, because there's it's I don't know if I'm going to say this correctly, but it's very encouraging to stay in the view and to stay into that state when you can pretty much just sort of let go and let the universe just sort of handle everything for you. And that increasingly is what's starting to happen. And can you just talk a little bit about that, how, whatever way that you'd like to, because it's very, it's just astounding.
Yeah, and you know the cardinal feature of that is it's actually just acknowledging what's already always the case, and there isn't really an alternative. The only alternative is to pretend otherwise, which is not in actuality. It's a pretense, like to pretend you have control, to pretend you know all these various other alternatives to this is doing itself. Don't hold water because they aren't verifiable. They aren't true. They're assertions. They're fantasies. Whereas if you observe the actual apparent flow of events, is completely beyond control. No one's steering it. It's doing what it wants to do. Let's say, I mean, whether or not it wants anything, that's euphemistic at best, and so on and so forth. And so all of this is really just noticing and appreciating what is actually the case, as opposed to choosing one way of being with it as opposed to another way of being with it. Because the other way of being with it is not being with it, it's just being with a distorted version of it which is not accurate. So it's really just a matter of getting real, of acknowledging the way things actually work. And there is certainly an apparent astounding functionality, you know. I mean, not that you can make sense of it or make heads or tails of it as to what it's doing or how it's doing it, but there's this amazing, you know, interactivity of all of these systems working together, interacting, life forms and coincidences and flows of events that seem to lead into other just, you know, whatever. I mean, all these different ways of trying to describe it, each of which are partial and inaccurate in themselves. So again, it's really just a matter of you know, noticing what is actually the case. I mean, getting real, letting go of our basically arrogant pretense to be able to say what's happening when it's so completely obvious. If you look, you know, honestly, it's doing itself. You know, always has been. I don't know if I addressed what you've been thinking about.
Well, it also, again, I'm not too sure I really know what I'm talking about, but it feels like there's these sort of flows, and I found myself in them, and when I do, then everything's just going sort of as it should.
Yeah.
And when I'm struggling, it's painful, difficult, aggravating, all those sorts of words.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if you, I don't know, if you begin to see those flows.
Well, again, when you sort of let go into this, you see them because that's what there is, and you see that that's what there always has been. And when you try to counter it, you discover all this turbulence because you're trying to do things in a way that counters what's actually happening. And so there's the world's version and there's your version of which, and if they diverge, which they inevitably will, there's going to be a tension, there's going to be a mismatch, there's going to be a struggle, there's going to be a, wait a minute, this isn't going the way I want, you know, what am I going to do? Kind of thing. Whereas if you just, you know, surrender to what is the case. Even calling it surrender is kind of silly because it's really more of an acknowledgement of what is already true. It's more of a getting real. But it can feel like a surrendering relative to the alternative of having our own sort of contrived ideas of what's going on. Then you do notice that that reality works by these, you know, call them flows or confluences of event, or this incredible functional unfolding of functional intelligence that just goes, it just all sorts of systems interacting like gears of a machine that they just work together in strange ways to produce whatever they're producing, all for its own benefit, which of course is your own benefit since you are it. So the alternative to that way of doing it is not going to be an improvement. If anything, if anything, it's going to be a friction and a struggle and a discord, because you'll be fighting with actuality, and of course actuality is going to win. So
everything. The more I think about it, the more no matter what happens, everything has to be perfect.
Of course.
And so, even when I struggle against things, that's how. It's sort of how it's meant to be in some way or another. There's these lessons I need to learn.
Sure.
It's like you keep talking about this sort of immense intelligence.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting anybody's pulling strings or anything is pulling strings, but it's your metaphor of the gears, I think, is a good one.
Yeah. And it, I think all of its apparent functioning is its way of working with itself. I mean, euphemistically speaking, obviously not defining it, and including when we're immature with it and being pig-headed with it and being less than artful with it, that it's doing that too as a way of bringing it to itself. You can think of it as, you can call it learning. It's teaching you to not do it that way. You're getting lessons out of the deal, which is really just a way of saying it's bringing itself to itself more and more profoundly, more and more accurately. It's discovering itself. It's and all of this apparent functioning is nothing other than that, as near as I can see. And so even when we are functioning immaturely, that is still part and parcel of this very intrinsic mechanism of the radiance coming to know itself. And then when we begin to be with it more maturely, and let it be what it intrinsically is, without needing to postulate all these fantastic deviations of our own, our version versus the actual version, then the radiance is with itself more maturely, and at that point we're kind of off the hook. That's the freedom from karma, because at that point the radiance is being with the radiance, and that's always what has been happening. But we've been interpreting the radiance coming to itself as our struggle with our life, which is, in other words, we've been factoring on us into the equation and imputing that it has all these responsibilities and challenges and all that. But once it becomes clear, when you're with this as it is, it becomes clear that it's just the radiance being with itself, doing everything all along, and all of a sudden you're off the hook. Because there's not even a you entity in the transaction. It's just the radiance doing the radiance. And you can look back and see, well, it has been all along, and I was tilting at windmills, when there's nothing there, but actually it's just been doing everything all along. And again, this is fundamentally coming to what is actually the case and what has always been actually the case. So it's really just a matter of getting real, of just acknowledging what, letting this be what it actually is, without thinking it requires our version.
That's related. I was trying to say this earlier, but to do a little better. I've thought that I associate noticing with like a particular stance,
Right.
or even a state, and that it is a technique for making things special or seeing how special things are. and as such, it was setting up a whole, the kind of dichotomy between states, basically. But what I'm finding now is that I used to think that it was like in terms of a stance. I mean, like, well, you got to be, it would be analogous to the stance would be analogous to having to be sitting on a cushion with a straight posture,
right.
and doing the proper thing with a proper relationship with thoughts and breath and the sensation, all this kind of stuff. And now it's more like, well, when I'm picking my butt, if I just notice what's happening, then it starts to thaw that whole thing out, and it does become special. But it's not a model that I'm imposing on top.
Yeah.
And so it's really like I said, starting from where you are.
Yeah.
It's really like, and I mean, you're saying that. I mean, if you're saying that everything is a finish line, that means that everything.
Yeah. Everything.
Everything.
Yeah.
And even shit is and boring, mundane solidity is it.
Yeah.
And then all I do is have to look at that a little closer, and then it just starts doing its thing because I'm seeing what's actually happening, and also it becomes everything becomes lively, not because I'm contriving it or that's the model that everything is radiance, and everything is dynamism, and so I have to see it that way.
It's radiance because it happens to be.
Yeah.
Everything happens to be radiance. Everything happens to be transcendental.
Yeah.
Normalcy happens to be transcendental, inclusively.
Yeah.
So it doesn't require specialness. It doesn't need anything. It doesn't need to be made special, or you don't need to find specialness. There's nothing but.
Yeah.
All you need to do is stop defining it as not special, which it turns out it can only happen in your imagination because intrinsically it is transcendent. It happens to be. It's not that it is transcendental and through some quirk. It just happens to be. That's what happens to be going on here. That happens to be physics. That happens to be actuality, is that it's a very weird virtual system that's bootstrapping itself up out of nothing. And that it just happens to be that is the case. And so all normalcy, of course, is made of that. All specialness is made of that. Anything is made of that. Nothing cannot be made of that because that's the only thing there is. And so once you notice that, it doesn't demand anything because it's a matter of just noticing what it already is, what it already has been, always. It can't not be that. And it doesn't, it is that even if you don't notice it. It doesn't even require you to notice it. But you can notice it. And once you do notice it, you can go, yeah, interesting, yeah, that's how it is. And then you get, okay, this is interesting. It's kind of, you'd have thought that this is how things are, but gosh, sure is. And then, okay, so then what? Well, whatever,
I guess I didn't believe how radically non-goal-oriented and non-technique oriented this is.
Yeah.
I mean, it has nothing, it's radically not that.
Yeah.
Noticing is not that. It's not,
it's normalcy. And normalcy is anything. Normalcy is whatever happens to be happening. Whatever happens to be happening. It's just about, actuality is a good word for it. Actuality. Whatever happens to be actual, it happens to be absolute transcendence, absolute transcendentality. Just happens to be that is the case. And so since that is the case, it's noticeable that that's the case. And if you happen to notice that's the case, you get to appreciate it, and you get to let go of seeking specialness, because it's hard to find anything more special than normalcy, it turns out. So specialness is just another version of normalcy. It's not actually better than any other version of normalcy. The special and the mundane, you can be lost in meditation, having transcendental samadhis and visions of light, or you can be flipping someone off on the highway in traffic, and there's no difference whatsoever in terms of the actual condition that is present.
If you can see the transcendental in even imagination and spin doctrine, and it doesn't stick.
Of course,
it just passes through.
Yeah, our neurotic personalities are this intrinsic transcendence. Our not seeing it and questioning for it are this intrinsic transcendence. Our confusion is this intrinsic transcendence. So it just doesn't matter. It really just doesn't matter at all.
But you gotta look.
Well, if you want to, if you can look. You don't even have to look, but you can look, and if you do look, you will see what it is because it is what it is. So naturally, that's discoverable, and it happens that it's not concealed; it's completely obvious. So if you do look, you will see what it is, and then you will see that you are resting in that. You can't not rest in that. There's no alternative, because the alternative would be that anyway. So even if you did an alternative, you'd still be resting in this. Right? Because that's what there is. It's the only building block around, so any edifice you end up in is going to be made of it. So you can go into all sorts of elaborate trips and neuroses and projects and constructions and all that, and of course that will be nothing other than this. Because this is all there is. This is what there is. It's intrinsically what this and any condition is made of. Because any condition is just a euphemism for this. I mean, that's the fallacy of most spirituality. It's predicated on playing states off against each other. It's predicated on playing experiences off against each other, and this whole elaborate lexicon of techniques designed to produce altered states, which, if not supposed to be superior in themselves, are supposed to be accumulations of something that will lead to some superiority. But it's all inaccurate. It's all untrue. It's not actually like that.
Well, the noticing is cumulative, though.
Well, noticing is cumulative in effect, but you aren't gaining anything. You gain facility to notice. With anything, the more you do it, the better you get at it. But you're not actually gaining anything.
And it doesn't abide either.
No, it doesn't abide. The only thing that does abide is this actuality, what this is, and it abides. It never departs from itself. Atemporally, it just never departs from itself. So this condition, the only thing that abides is what this is. And it presents as all these comings and goings, which don't actually come and go from anything because they never depart from it. They are within it. Just like whatever you dream in a dream never departs from sleep. Never departs from the dreaming. You could dream anything, but it never goes anywhere. It's not like you dream something and you're going somewhere. You dream something and you're right here in the dream. Whatever happens, it's just right here. It never went anywhere. And this is exactly the same way. It can look like anything, but it never departs from itself. So even forgetting itself is itself. It doesn't depart from itself. And remembering itself is just itself. It doesn't gain anything by remembering itself.
Although the gain dynamism that was already there, but this matter of being able to see it is.
Well, you get to appreciate it.
Yeah.
But you don't actually gain it because it was always there.
Right.
There's always been nothing but dynamism.
But it's a lot more pleasant experiencing dynamism.
Yeah. Cool. Go for it.
Right. Well, I was waiting for you to deny that one.
There's a trick in that. It's not that you're suddenly noticing it, it's that you're realizing you've been ignoring it. And then, for me,
Yeah, that's true.
you've been ignoring it. You've been covering it up, you've been looking elsewhere.
Not seeing it is an active condition. You have to actively create a condition of not seeing, whereas seeing it is the normal state. Because it always sees itself. And even not seeing it is seeing it, of course, because there's nothing else to see.
Well, right.
But you're having to elaborately misdefine it in order to convince yourself that you're not seeing it. So it's a lot more work to not see it than it is to see it. Noticing is the result of letting go.
Of letting go of ignoring it.
Yeah, you're letting go of all this effort, and not seeing it takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of work. That's why people suffer so much and are so stressed and all this Weltschmerz and stuff. It's just because it's a lot of work not seeing reality. And when you let go of all that, reality is what's left, of course, and it's effortless. Line of least resistance is like, just fuck it, just let go, just like, whatever. And all of a sudden, what is there? Well, just this, doesn't go away. Letting go doesn't stop anything. And yet, what it is just what it is, not you doing all this elaborate name calling, all this elaborate designating, all this elaborate defining and spin dodging. Oh, but what I'm really doing is this, and and I'm really trying to overcome this, all of it. A lot of words. Like, I don't know. Who's this? The line of least resistance is enlightenment. It's the easy way is the way out of delusion. Delusion is a lot of work. It's really a lot of work. It's a very active, demanding way of being, way of functioning.
Ironically, radiance does that too.
What's that?
Ironically, radiance is performing that particular
Well, of course.
magic trick.
So surely many people at the retreat, for example, had glimpses or might have been able to rest in that for a while, but you can't keep it with them.
Possibly.
Well, they're not aware for a very long time. So, so why do you think that is?
Because being able to rest in this is a product of what might be called karmic maturity, and which cannot be contrived. You get karmically mature by finding yourself becoming karmically mature, not by wanting to be. It's the same way a teenager gets to be an adult. Not by wanting to be, but by letting time pass until you find yourself, look around and go, oh, I guess I'm an adult. And likewise, this stuff is, spiritual recognition, let's call it, is not fakeable. You can't contrive it. On the other hand, anyone that's interested in it at all, that is a symptom that they are at least flirting with maturity, so they are beginning to move into that.
It's also scary, letting go.
Yeah.
And it's much more comfortable, even though it's work, to go back into established beliefs.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we're used to defining our security in terms of our worldview. We're used to defining our security in terms of our self-definition, our definition of the world, and we hold that very rigidly, and we cling to that holding because we imagine that it's actually a protection of some kind, which is a complete misunderstanding.
Well, also I think people have this tendency to say, I have worked to get this letting go, and now I have to work at it again to get it back again.
Yeah.
And they misunderstand.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly so. Exactly. People approach letting go from within their normal way of approaching anything, which is as a construction.
Yeah.
And letting go is the opposite of construction in actuality, of course.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not a task.
Good point. Yeah. Letting go is dropping construction. Yeah. And but you can't get that till you get it. And you get it by coming to it, and that's why I sort of euphemize it as a process of maturing, because that's kind of what it looks like. It looks like something that you start to approach, you start to flirt with it, and you sort of dip into it or touch it, and then you move back into your old mode. Kind of like, if you watch children moving from childhood into adolescence, you find the same thing. They're playing with their dolls or their toys, toy trucks or whatever, and then they start, whatever, right? Reading some magazine or doing something that's decidedly not a childhood-like behavior, but they'll go right back to the toys and stuff. But eventually, they spend more and more time with the new mode of activities and less time with the toys, and ultimately the toys are sitting on a shelf somewhere, and there's just no interest in them. And it's very, very much the same in terms of this, in terms of being with our experience, in terms of our relatively immature modes of definition and orientation and worldviews, and eventually, and we begin to just sort of flirt with this alternatives, but we go back to what's familiar. But eventually, we sort of are spending more and more time with the flirting and less time with the familiar, and again, it sort of comes to a point where the transition is made. It just seems to be like that.
I mean, it really, it's almost as if you could call it dematuring, really.
Well, sure.
Because maturing is so tied into us believing there's somewhere to get to.
Yeah, no, that's true. And also, as human beings in society, being mature is sort of synonymized with knowing who you are, knowing what you're doing, having this definition, having this whole presentation, having sort of a more or less coherent personality, having plausible deniability, all this kind of stuff,
Yeah.
And this actuality is just absolutely letting go. So in a certain sense, in a profound sense, it's an absolutely infantile and childlike condition. But it's an infantile and childlike condition that takes along with it a high degree of functionality. So it's actually more like a second childhood, because you keep and incorporate whatever levels of functionality you've developed in the course of becoming an actual historical adult, but you let go of needing to the mechanisms that you felt like you were using to build that or to acquire that or to move into that. It's all very fascinating, and all this is empirical. There's no way to have a theory of it. There's no way to say what it actually is or why it happens to be that way. It's just observable that it seems to be more or less kind of like that. And so we can just take advantage of that view to try and get a handle. Oh yeah, I can see that kind of happening. Whatever.
The view doesn't seem to rely upon any particular skills or competence that I can.
Oh no.
I mean, it's not analytical. It's not emotional.
Oh no.
It's not instinctual.
Well, that's the thing.
It's not imaginative.
It's intrinsic. It's literally what being intrinsically is. It's physics. It's light shining. Light shining doesn't demand anything from us. And likewise, this being what it is and doing what it does not demand anything. It's intrinsic. I mean, I use this word intrinsic and inherent a lot, and I mean that in most specifically, that it's what it is doing all that. There's absolutely no requirement of anything added in terms of functionality or action or activity or posturing or anything. It's just it being what it happens to be does everything and is all value, and any functioning or non-functioning of an individual nature that also happens is it too ultimately, so is irrelevant. It doesn't need to stop. You don't need to stop personal activity, but it becomes irrelevant, because if you engage in it, it is this primal condition anyway. So it's it kind of it's what it inherently does everything.
Well, you were mentioning earlier about karmic maturity, and I guess that's not exactly a skill. That just sort of seems to be some sort of an account of some sort.
Mm.
I mean, for folks who would have an interest, then let's maybe I ought to become karmically mature.
Yeah.
But that's not how I hear you talk about it.
Well, you can't. It's not something you can do.
Yeah.
But it's something you can observe.
Mm-hmm.
You can observe that. Wow, you're kind of. If you find yourself either A, interested in and B, able to approach any of this kind of stuff at all, then that right there is a symptom of what I would call karmic maturity.
Observation is so good too, I think.
Well, she said that letting go is not a construction. Well, she said that. Somebody said it's not a construction. But I know of at least 3 different systems where there's, anywhere from 3 to 7 steps to letting go.
I'm on the 6th step. I really am hopeful of getting to the 7th step. I've paid my monthly dues, so hopefully they'll send me the secret instructions.
Well, that's part of what, for me, is the problem with organised religions or paths.
Oh yeah.
They always work. They do this, and you will get there.
Yeah.
Do this and this and this, and you'll do that. And in fact, what you have to do is stop doing this and stop doing this and stop doing this, and maybe you'll see something.
Yeah.
It's the same amount of work either way, though.
No.
Works differently for different.
To stop doing, I mean, if you try to stop doing something,
Well, that's-
you're
that's-
working again.
Right.
And it seems to me, Peter, that a lot of what's changed is dimensionality, and a lot of the dimensionality, which is to do with the lateral, sort of movement, is what I notice that doesn't apply anymore in some sense, in terms of destination or observable, field of vision or expansion or relationality, that there seems to be a lot more attention to the deepening experience in each moment, which in a sense is sort of just a change in awareness.
Yeah. I mean, the way I would put something like that is more immature modes tend to be outwardly directed and situationally oriented in terms of what you're doing, what you're related to. You're sort of outwardly oriented to circumstances or situations apparently. But as you get more and more mature, your relationship shifts to just being related to the radiance, and which turns out to be the same thing, but it's not oriented in such an elaborated outward way that you need to keep track of. Just oriented to the radiance itself accomplishes all that because the radiance is already doing all that. The radiance is already incorporating all circumstances, and when you just be with the radiance, you are with that which is already doing all that without needing to track it, without needing to keep a record of it or sort it out or have a plan about it or keep maps or keep structures or notes. Keep notes. If you're just with the radiance, you're with that which is doing all that intrinsically. So But so the feeling tone is a very different orientation, because instead of being all, you just, because the radiance is non-spatial. The radiance is just sort of a deep oceanic multidimensionality that is very non-specific relative to the apparent specifics of all the circumstances and blah, 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 blah. But it turns out it's one and the same. So by being with it's like being with the root of the tree or being with all of the leaves. You're going to be with all the leaves, it's a lot to keep track of and a lot to follow. But you go to the root, you're with that which is feeding the leaves. So you're connected to the leaves without needing to spread yourself thin. You can just plug into that. And, as an analogy, being with the radiance is like that. It's being with the root condition, which is already intrinsically doing all of the elaboration. So you don't need to follow it. And you're sort of upstream from all of that. So you are actually with that which is more powerfully oriented to that stuff instead of playing catch up. When you're chasing around trying to orient to circumstances, you're kind of downstream from the circumstances. So you're in a position of less power. But when you're with the radiance, you're upstream from the circumstances because you're with that which is actually doing the circumstances. So you're sort of in the control room in a way, even though it's counterintuitive in a logical sense, because the radiance is so non-specific and so amorphous and so just sort of, and yet that is what all the specificity flowers out of, all the circumstances and the complexity flowers out of. So you are actually with all of that in sort of a different, in a more efficient way, in a more primal way.
You're plugged in.
Yeah, plugged in. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like being at the CPU instead of being on the screen and the keyboard. Maybe.
Again, you're plugged. You've always been plugged in, but you're no longer ignoring the fact.
Yeah, it's a matter of orientation. Yeah.
Well, I think the whole getting it that you to stop ignoring it by making up stories to divert your attention from it.
Yeah.
That's all they are, aren't they?
A movie is a good example too. You know, you can be with the images on the screen, or you can go right up to the projectionist with the lens that all the light's shining through, and you're with all of the images where they're one, where they're centralized, where they're integrated, instead of being with it out in the elaboration.
But not to be confused with directionality of attention.
No. It's more well, I can't say how it is. It's more more metaphysical than that.
A lot of traditions have attention models more like this. They want it like that. You know, including the inquiry and blah blah blah.
But that's, inquiry is still with the leaves. It's still on the movie screen. The radiance is not like that. The radiance is beyond self and other. The radiance is beyond here and there. The radiance is beyond outer and inner. The radiance is, because it's transdimensional. It's just the primal whatever of this.
It feels like the whole thing, like the field.
Yeah.
It's a field.
Yeah, it's the field, but the radiance is the field before it unfolds to be a field. Mm-hmm. Well, it's also the field after it unfolds. It's the whole deal. It's like the light in the movie theater. The light is the movie at the lens, and it's also the movie at the screen, and it's all the light. And so it's the same light whether you see it one place or another place. But it has this interesting property of not always being spread out. If you just were aware of movies in terms of the readout, in terms of what's on the screen, you would think a movie is this big spread out panorama of details of light, which is frequently how we think of this situation here. But if you see how movies work, you see that the light intrinsically has this spread out readout mode, but it also has a mode where it's extremely concentrated. And that's exactly analogous to the way the radiance works. So you can be with the radiance in circumstantially. So you can be with a sensory experience and see the radiance and see the transcendence. But as you come to know the radiance, you can be with it more directly in a sort of its enfolded mode, or it's a more concentrated mode, it's aspatial mode, and you're with the same thing without needing to be with it here. You can just be with it, where it is. It's not which it turns out to be non-local, but it turns out to be where you are.
I'm not sure if I understand that, other than seeing without definitions. I mean,
that's fine. Okay. It's the same. It's another way of saying the same thing. Okay. Seeing without definitions automatically does that.
Is it the three kayas too in a way?
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, the three kayas. the outer kaya, the Nirmanakaya, is a lot like the movie where the lights spread out on the screen with all the light and dark and motion, and the Sambhogakaya is a lot like the light shining from the projector, and the Dharmakaya is the light bulb. So, and you can find these are not abstractions, you can find these concretely in the experience right here. Just the being, the isness, the presence, just that pure fact of this is present, this is, undeniably. And yet that isness is not modulated, it has no flavors or change or dynamism or differentiation whatsoever. It's just, this isness is just uniformly isness. This is the Dharmakaya. And the Sambhogakaya is a little harder to spot. The Sambhogakaya is just a good way to spot Sambhogakaya is just in the sort of proliferation of intelligence, the proliferation of... Yes, energy. But it's the energy before it has become a readout, before it's become something. So in the energy of experiencing, you can find the Sambhogakaya. And this is like being with the radiance upstream. And then by the time it becomes a readout with all of these differentiations and full fields of sensory experience and all that, that's in the Nirmanakaya. And then there's the fourth kaya, the kaya of confusion, which is where you think the Nirmanakaya actually is something instead of a readout of radiance.
So some of our normal emotional states, let's say something like boredom is actually like the fourth kaya.
Well, if you're holding as boredom, it is. Of course, intrinsically, it's just a present energy.
Yeah, but when you look at it, it's not boredom. I mean,
Yeah.
It's dynamic. The readout seems boring because it's static.
Yeah.
But then when you look at it, you realize it's not static, and that
Right.
would be...
And when you look at it, it resolves to the three kayas. Because the three kayas are all intrinsically transcendental, even though the third kaya it deals in specificity, it's still intrinsically transcendental. In other words, which means you can't say what it is. As soon as you can say what something is, or something seems to be something in particular, differentiable from something else in particular, then you're in confusion. When you have any feeling you can say what something is, you're in confusion. When you're actually with anything, you discover very quickly that you can't pin it down. It is what it is, but you try and pin it down, and it's like, woof, it's like, whoa. It definitely is itself, but wow, what is that? Wow, it's weird. And all of a sudden, in that, you're in the three kayas. And then it's just a matter of your level of focus, so to speak, which of the kayas you're in, because they aren't actually separable. They're more ways of seeing this.
But if you see any one of them, you can get to the others as well.
Yeah, because they're one and the same.
Yeah.
It's like if you're seeing a movie, then there is the projector, there is the light shining out, and there is the screen. It's one phenomenon.
Right, yeah.
It's one phenomenon. The three kayas is a way of kind of deconstructing that, or whatever you call it. But of course you can't actually deconstruct it because it's a unity.
Interdependent.
Yeah, you can say yeah. Except there's no separate pieces to actually be interdependent.
Right,
It's-
that's what Tibetans say,
yeah.
it is interdependent thing.
Well, just a point of interest here, the people who wrote about deconstruction really, it's really not a taking apart, it's really recognizing that nothing actually is nearly as concrete as everybody thought it was. So all those French theorists, what they were showing is that you really couldn't see what anything really was, and any attempt to do so just led you around in a circle. And so it sort of looked like philosophy, but it really didn't look like philosophy, and that's why nobody really liked it. But
Oh, good.
That's funny.
Good. Well, in my ignorance, I didn't even know what deconstruction was. So it works nicely.
Nobody really knows what
We really knew what it was either.
Because you can't deconstruct it.
You can't even deconstruct deconstruction.
It's funny making up a fourth kaya. How'd you come up with that? What do you call it? The fuck kaya?
The stupid kaya.
I like that.
Stupid kaya.
He also has 5 truths.
Slight truth.
They're not at all noble.
was thinking today about reification and the deeply paradoxical nature of this idea of reification. We think that we make something real. It seems like actually reification would be the fourth trial.
Yeah, exactly. We think we're making it real, but we're actually making it unreal. Because the reality of it is actually intrinsic transcendence, i.e. being infinite dimensional and unresolvable. As soon as we think we can resolve it and make it real, make it concrete, make it static, make it definable, we're actually making it unreal, because that condition doesn't actually exist. You have to postulate it and imagine it into existence, and even then it doesn't exist, except it's a fantasy. But still, you can meaningfully free associate it on to the undifferentiable actuality, and convince yourself that you have actually pinned things down.
It seems to be a powerful little tool, this idea of reification. They use it in the literature a lot, and I didn't even know the word about 2 years ago when I started. But throughout this whole evening's conversation, I've seen how reification is really the core of almost every step that was spoken about today.
Mm-hmm.
What is your definition of that? Because I've used the word and heard, but
it's making something real, but in the sense of making it into an entity. Reification is basically the creation of an entity.
Oftentimes from abstractions and models and theories and concepts. So initially those things are developed so that people can talk about things, but then before they know it, they actually think that they're real, and they're pretending like they're just about as hard and objective as anything, when in fact it's just an abstraction. It's just a thing that you do with your mind. And everybody sort of forgets that.
When you become mature, when you've reified most of your world, you've joined the mature.
Yeah. And you're firmly, at that point, you're firmly entrenched in delusion.
Remember the thought.
Yeah.
And you defend your reifications.
But we're talking about seemingly covering a lot of ground tonight, but it's important to notice that there's just one thing we're talking about, and we're talking about it in a lot of different ways, but it's just one thing, which is this intrinsic condition, the view, this nature, this intrinsic transcendence, being as it is, and all, which is one thing, it's one phenomenon. And all of this stuff we're talking about, looking at it from different angles and all that, refers to nothing other than this one thing. And on that note, let's break for...
Yeah, our 15-minute, 5-minute break.
We'll be back shortly, online people.
Somehow we never managed to make it 5 minutes. Just won't happen. Just won't happen.
Kashmir Shaivism and Dzogchen end up at the same conclusion through different elaborations, but the way in which they're essentially the same teaching is that they both include the notion that the primal condition and all of the elaborations of the primal condition do not depart from the primal condition, and that the primal condition is intrinsically transcendental. So that they're both extreme non-dual systems, but they're also extremely integrated in the sense that any degree of elaboration of the original nature is the original nature and never departs from it.
Are you back, Mark?
Yeah. So that which is unique features of both Kashmir Shaivism and Dzogchen. The particulars that they put out are quite different, but they're essentially the same. When you boil down to the principles involved, they're exactly the same principles. So, if you are a master of Kashmir Shaivism or a master of Dzogchen, you're dealing with the same thing and working with the same thing, even if you use different terminology and a different philosophical framework.
Peter, you didn't start the broadcast.
Yeah, dude, it's broadcasting.
Oh, okay.
It says it is here anyway.
Okay.
So
I
hopefully.
just checked on that too.
Are there any books you'd recommend about Kashmir Shaivism?
There's a bunch of books. There's not a lot of great ones.
I got one that's like really academic.
Yeah, most of them are. There's one called Doctrine of Vibration, which is which is pretty good.
Okay.
The best books, in my opinion, are the root texts, but you have to wade through them.
Mm-hmm.
There's three. Kashmir Shaivism is called Trika philosophy, which means Trika means triple, and Kashmir Shaivism has three main approaches. One of which is epitomized in the three root texts of each main approach.
Right.
One is the Shiva Sutras, which is the root of all Kashmir Shaivism. The second is called the Spanda Karikas, which is the root of the Spanda tradition and Kashmir Shaivism. Spanda means the principle of intrinsic dynamism, the principle that reality is intrinsically creative or intrinsically radiant. And the third is the Pratyabhijna. The root text is called the Pratyabhijna Hridayam, which means Pratyabhijna means recognition, and Hridayam means heart. So Pratyabhijna Hridayam means the heart of recognition, or the essence of recognition. And recognition is the third main principle, or the main stream in the philosophy of Kashmir Shaivism. But you can study those three root texts. There's been some modern translations which are probably iffy, but the best translations, I think, were done, I don't know when, the 60s or 70s, or someone by a guy named Jaidev Singh.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And they're very weighty. There's the Sanskrit text, and then the literal translation, and then a prose translation, and then exhaustive, ancient commentaries and their translations and the whole thing. So you have to kind of wade through it, but it's worth it, because then you get what they were actually talking about instead of some modern popularized view. There's a lot of more modern books on Kashmir Shaivism. Probably the most authoritative ones are by a guy named, I think his name is Swami Lakshman Ju, who was the master of sort of the living embodiment, the living master of Kashmir Shaivism until he died a few years back. But he has several books out that they're books of his teachings. I don't know that he actually wrote them, or he had a Westerner who spent a lot of time with him, who took down these things and transcribed them, and what all, I don't know. But there's several books that are out in his name that they're good, but they're not nearly as comprehensive or explanatory as the root texts.
Mm-hmm.
He has a version of the Shiva Sutras he put out with his explanations. But again, I really like the root text myself. But it's not easy reading.
Yeah. I would think, you're talking voluminous amounts of insight and teachings that are included in these things. I would think, just by the way you talk about realization stuff, that you would consider a lot of that stuff baggage.
It is. But the point is that the reason these things are presented so voluminously is it addresses and incorporates all sorts of apparent aspects or objections. So, in other words, if you're coming from the outside, you start with a relatively fragmented worldview, and a really comprehensive exposition sort of gathers up all those fragments and indicates sort of one at a time sequentially the way each one of those is actually the root principle. So it's like the Longchenpa book. Dzogchen is essentially very simple, but this book is encyclopedic, and he talks about exactly the same principle from 37 different points of view, with slight minute variations and emphasizing this aspect or that aspect. The point being, not that anything is gained by that, but that it's like herding sheep. You gather fragmented misunderstandings, and sort of take each one of them and say, yes, this one's over here is the way it is, but actually, you sort of lead it back to the center and show the way in which it is actually this too. So it's like remedial, and even the way that the texts are presented, if they're artfully done, and the three root texts, especially the Shiva Sutras and Kashmir Shaivism, are very artfully done. They're sutras. They're not. They're like revealed, enlightened utterances. They aren't, some guy sitting down saying, "Well, I think I'll write a book." But it's presented holographically. So they start with the essential principle, and then slight elaborations of the central principle, and then slight elaborations of those. Always, so you're always around this, or you're always around the center. Like it's like a mandala. It's not like a hierarchical outline presentation.
What I get from Longchenpa is I get an image of a huge earthen dam, and the water's seeping through it in the beginning, and the dirt clouds are flowing down, and each one of these little things is a part of my calcified mind for either things I've accepted just from a priori and growing up, or even philosophical things I've accepted. These things are dissolving like dirt clouds, one by one. And the water keeps coming.
That's nice.
More and more.
Yeah, it's like he has specific little solutions that will dissolve anything you can come up with. So, but what about this? And he's like, oh, okay. If you go to chapter 8, paragraph 27, he addresses that issue, and you look at it and you go, oh yeah, and all of a sudden that
dissolves.
Because that's interesting. Is normally the way books are written is that they're proving a certain point, so you hold it a certain way. But it sounds like this one starts with the holding a certain way and then opens it up.
Well, there's no holding. It's about, it points out the inherent condition and then illustrates the way in which all the elaborations of the inherent condition are the inherent condition.
And he must have had an experience of the inherent condition to write a book like
Oh, Longchenpa was a Dzogchen master. He was considered one of the greatest that ever lived, as well as a brilliant scholar. So it was like a confluence, a coming together of unusual talents in one person.
In artistry and also a sense of humor that comes through.
Oh, he's wonderful. He's wonderful. It was just obviously superlative being.
And a sharp tongue now and then. I hadn't noticed.
Oh yeah.
A sharp tongue.
Oh yeah, he can be a little
Flattering
radical. Yeah.
But with humor and love. That's awesome.
But that's the very nature of this. This is, it intrinsically has a fractal-like organization where it is one absolute simplicity, and yet any and every elaboration is of that one root simplicity, and that doesn't depart from that one root simplicity, even as it is this incredible elaboration and diversification. So, which is a very non-linear, seemingly strange way for something to be if you're used to sort of a logical, human logic, either or logic and that kind of thing. But nonetheless, it isn't. It happens to intrinsically be somewhat like that, and so it is addressable in those kinds of ways. It's like kind of what we do here. We've been talking about this one root phenomenon, this one root principle, but we've been talking about it sort of from this angle and that angle and this. But what about this? What about and it's actually talking about one thing, but this one thing we're used to seeing it in terms of having all these aspects, and in ignorance we're used to thinking these aspects are very separate and differentiable from each other. But when we look at them, if we do so artfully, we'll discover they are actually this root condition as well, which is the whole point of this kind of an exercise, is it's integrated. Because the point isn't to leave the normal human worldview. The point is to discover that the normal human worldview is exactly this transcendent condition. You don't leave normalcy to some transcendence. It happens that the normal human condition is that and has always been that, and you can see that anywhere you look within the human condition, you find this transcendence if you see how to see it, if you see what it actually is, how it actually what it actually consists of. So all of this is kind of the tree and its leaves is a good thing. There's the root, there's the trunk, which is one thing, and then there's the twigs, all these twigs, and then all these thousands of leaves. But it's just sort of one system. And likewise, human elaboration, the elaborations of our lives is a lot like that. It's one phenomena that shows up as all of this incredible diversification, which happens to never depart from the one phenomena. as you've all heard me say over and over again, in my opinion, the easiest way to access this one phenomenon is with the radiance, because the radiance shows up as the elaborations, and it also is the essence of it. So anywhere you touch the radiance, you follow it. It's like in a movie theater. Once you see the light, then it all makes sense. You can be with the light on the screen, you can be with the light shining in your head, and you can be with the light back in the bulb of the projector. And so the light's sort of the common denominator. Here the radiance is the common denominator. Experientially, because experience is this radiance, and all the elaborate details of our sensory fields and our mentality and anything is made of this radiance. But this radiance shines from nowhere, spontaneously sort of bootstraps itself up out of nothing. And on that level, all of this elaboration is one thing, one dynamism, one primal dynamism of this one beingness or isness or presence that is here. So the radiance is very easy to get, even superficially, just in the texture of experience, just being with the texture of something you're seeing, and right away, if you just with what is present, you will be seeing the radiance, and as soon as you see the radiance is slippery. The radiance includes its whole path, so to speak. So you don't just stay with the surface of it. It also that's why when you look at things, they're so fuzzy and they're so transcendental, because that's the radiance intrinsically leading you to its full body, to its full extension, which is sort of hyperspatial and multidimensional and what have you.
Hyperspatial.
Yep. Hyperspatial. Transspatial. Paraspatial. As long as we're making up words, let's see. Metaspatial, how about that? I kind of like hyperspatial because of the sci-fi tie-in.
You would.
Well, I just was wondering what you mean by that.
That the apparent spatiality of experience includes aspects that are not simply spatial, but that are a kind of a spatiality. So there's the spatiality of like the space of this room, so the three-dimensional space. But if you look at that phenomena of spatiality, it actually includes more than that. There's space, there's dimension, there's space, sort of, let's see, a space-like dimensionality that transcends just the three dimensions, that is also present immediately in experience. It's not important to get that, it's not important to analyze it, but it happens to be the case. Let me see if I can elaborate that any more precisely. Well, it's like you see the space that your eyes see, like say the three-dimensional space, but there's also your mind space, which is part of the experience. There's a space. I mean, this sensory space is already hyperspatial, because you have the space of sound, you have the space of sensation, you have the space of mentality, you have the space of all these different qualities, which somehow are related to each other, and yet somehow are very different from each other. And so it's so there's the spatialities that are aspects of this overall spatiality of experience that are not just a simple three-space spatiality. You can locate that picture compared to that table, but where is your idea of freedom located relative to those two things? You know, that's a meaningless question, and yet it's somewhere, or pseudo-spatially it's somewhere. There is an implicit sort of a kind of a spatiality of where thought happens, but it's not a simple three-space spatiality, but it's somehow included in this system. So that's what it kind of, that's one very clumsy indication of what I mean by hyperspatial.
Well, we usually connect that or associate that with multidimensionality, which seems to be...
Yeah, it's another way of saying the same thing.
The same thing.
Yeah. Because these dimensions have a lot of sort of space-like qualities. For example, thought occurs in a way that in a sort of a mode that is space-like in some ways. But if you look at it closely, it doesn't really hold water in a space in the same sense that the space that vision seems to imply. But still, it has a kind of an extension from itself. I mean, thought doesn't seem to be sort of collapsed to a point, you know. Somehow it seems to have a little spread out somehow, which is a kind of a spatiality in some way. Or not, I mean, I don't know, this is just, I mean, this is arbitrary, but...
Well, in a dream, you're thinking it's the mind.
Yeah.
A dream is spread out. The space in a dream
Is
is
right.
the mind.
And the space in a dream is very flexible.
Yeah.
It can be very specifically three-space like this, but it can also have other kinds of flexible spaces interspersed in it that the non-critical dreaming mind just sort of, like all of a sudden you can be sitting here and somehow, you know, and be somewhere else, and it somehow seems to work, you know, but it's not a simple three-space, but it is a spatiality. It represents as if it was spatial. So, in other words, there's the spatiality of experience is not a simple three-space. So that's what I mean by it being hyperspatial. And that's, you know, none of this is precise, but it's a way of kind of indicating that there's many aspects to the way the radiance can present. And of course, intrinsic in the radiance is that it generates these presentations. It generates these apparent modes. So the radiance is transspatial entirely, and yet apparent spatiality exists because of the intrinsic nature of the radiance. Makes it so that it seems to be that way, it seems to present that way.
Well, you could say that even this, not just the dream, is hyperspatial.
Oh,
in the same-
absolutely.
In the same way as the dream.
Yeah.
And the thing is that we've been, we need to ignore the thought space, which we have been more focused on. We've been more focused
Absolutely.
on always sensing the thought space, and it takes up more of the energy.
Absolutely. And there's myriad.
There is this dream thing that can happen in
totally,
this.
Totally. And there's countless other spatialities that are really very accessibly commonplace experience. You know, that we don't have words for them and we don't acknowledge them, so that they're largely
think
unconscious
of
of them, so we don't include them. You know, we may, or in the waking state, we orient towards visual three space, and everything else gets sort of shoehorned into that. But in actuality, in terms of just not even thought per se, but just sort of subtle energy experiences. I mean, there's all kinds of spatiality that has its own dimensionality that somehow interpenetrates this, or is related to this, or is unrelated to this in strange and nonlinear ways. And unrelated to each other, but somehow cross-related and all that. I mean, the whole thing is very, very slippery, and I mean, you know, to me, the hyperspatial makes perfect sense. You know, imagine a juxtaposition of all different kinds of spaces sort of coexisting as a system in some very strange nonlinear way. And to me, that's kind of describes kind of nicely what's going on here, from my point of view. I mean, not ultimately describes it, but describes, you know, an aspect of its presentation.
But if you haven't become aware of that space,
Yeah.
it's difficult to visualize it.
Oh, yeah, it's hard to visualize, but I think it's fairly easy to become aware once you know where to look. You know, once you begin to acknowledge just the nonlinear aspects of experience that are sort of between the categories.
Well, that's the thing. I've been finding that that in that time right before falling asleep and also waking up, that there's a lot of shit going on that's off the radar.
Yeah, totally.
Just what I noticed, and it's actually very enriching. But I thought it was very interesting when you said one time about thoughts. That notice where they're located. That some are right here inside, like right third eye. Some are like more like this. I know that dreams are like this. And I know that I'm becoming more aware of like sensations, out here where I always used to think the sensations are only in here.
Yeah.
But I'm curious. I remember back when I was in the Gurdjieff work, they were saying, well, great being like Jesus or something like that had like this presence that was like about his field of experience was like about a couple miles. They would put things like
They measured it.
They measured it, yeah. But it is curious. I mean, how much can you sense? How far? I mean, you're saying that we are the field. I mean, actually, can
When you see the Andromeda Galaxy, dude, that's where you are.
Then your field of experience is way
And where is
further than a
that?
couple miles.
Because it's not simply spatial. Miles
Miles is an idea.
is only
An idea.
applicable in visual space.
Not
Well, it's a
even-
sensation.
not
If
even.
I see something like a light from a star, I mean, it's a feeling that you feel the light. So I mean, it's
But
an
everything's a
experience.
feeling,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and feeling is presence. And it's all ultimately non-spatial. It's all ultimately
all
here.
here.
It's all here. How big is here? How big is a dream? It's a meaningless question.
Yeah, it doesn't
We start
apply.
talking about in terms of miles or light years or
Irrelevant.
anything is complete absurdity. Because it's not spatial. It has spatial aspects of presentation, or as I might say, hyperspatial aspects of presentation. But it itself is intrinsically transspatial. It exists outside of space and outside of time, and it generates space and time as apparent modes of its presentation.
Transspatial.
We talk that way too, though. I mean, we use language that way. This is the space I'm in today, or I woke
course.
up in this space this morning.
Totally.
And that could be an infinite number
Of course.
references.
Of course. Told you never to call me. I'll take care of it.
No, just mute it. That's all you need to do. Angie. Oh, it's Angie. I promised her. She's giving you information about our trip.
Dharmakaya is often part.
I'm sorry?
So in the textbooks, Dharmakaya is often thought of as space. In fact, the basic space of whatever it was. And I go round and around with that because how that can be space, and yet it seems to be space, maybe.
Dharmakaya is completely non-spatial, and yet it's ultimately spatial in the sense that all space exists within it, so to speak, or exists as an aspect of it. But Dharmakaya is completely non-spatial.
It would have to be, yeah, it would have to be. It sort of resolves into just being.
Yeah, it's both, it's non-dimensional as well as infinitely dimensional, and anything and everything in between.
Mm-hmm.
It's absolute transcendence. So how big is that?
Even what space is, we're using the term space over and over, but to try to catch a piece of space.
That's the point. That's the
what's
point.
that?
What space is Dharmakaya, which is not space.
There you go. That makes sense.
And yet, it is, to the extent it is space, then it is space.
Sure.
So it presents as space, while it's intrinsically transspatial, or intrinsically transcendental.
So why be rigid?
Yeah, well, it's silly. I mean, saying either or, trying to find ultimate differentiations is an absurdity, because there's only one thing happening. So all the apparent differentiation is that one thing, has to be, and yet it's clearly and obviously presents as a differentiation. So it's not an either or. The one thing is the differentiation. The differentiation is the one thing. to any degree of analysis.
So it's nothing, but it can appear as anything.
Nothing, anything, and as well as a specific thing. Those are just three ways of viewing the same thing, the same phenomena. With no view having any hierarchically more importance or more reality than any other view.
And the three kayas completely subsume all of that.
Yeah, exactly.
There's
Completely.
nothing outside those.
No, the three kayas is the whole system, and which is this.
And all of those things, those elements are now present right here
Yeah, but
in our experience.
yeah,
All three.
but there aren't really three. There's just this,
Yeah.
and you can see it as three, but it's just three aspects of the way this works. That is one thing. It's like saying water is wet, and water wets the hands and water flows, or water flows and water is reflective. But you can't find the reflectivity in the flowing and put the reflectivity over here and the flowing over here, because it's water. It's one thing. It's being analyzed in terms of apparently separate properties, but the separate properties aren't separate. They are the one thing.
What's remarkable to me is that all of these are apparent to everyone at all times.
Yeah.
Is it not true?
Absolutely. Reality is completely nakedly displayed. Everything is completely
You don't
obvious.
have to work 20 years to
No.
dig
No.
and get the gold.
No, and you don't need
It's
to
on
take
the
notes.
surface.
You don't need to take notes. There's nothing to remember. It's all, just look. Just look.
I'm never going to let you off.
This is a personal message to some people. just look. Just look, and it's all right here. So, oh, yeah. So the notepad, your notes, the comprehensive notes, the comprehensive explanation, the encyclopedia is this, and it's open.
You don't even have to notice because it's already there.
Yeah, but you
Noticing
can't.
would be the experience of knowing something that's already there.
Yeah, which is what experience intrinsically is.
Anyway,
Yeah, it's already, so it's already noticing what's already there. Doesn't need to. It's redundant for it to notice what's already here in the face of the fact that what it is already doing is noticing that which is here.
I noticed
It's all very paradoxical.
I noticed that this puts a whole lot of gurus out of a job.
Yeah, I hope.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be nice? Not likely though. Not bloody likely.
Well, I mean, people still have to pick up trash every week, and just that those things are not necessarily related to this.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Well, they are this.
Well, they're completely related to this. But they're not necessarily directing people toward this.
I took the note that experience is noticing, and I'm glad I did. Because that's a very advanced thing, which would never occur to me unless I read it again and again.
Good.
Anyway, I have a question. I'm a little bit, because of my life state, I'm tired, but I'm just interested. I'm interested in it because we go to sleep every night, and we think, we go unconscious. So basically, you just sort of go into yourself, and this all goes away. But it's different than that, I think. I mean, it's like, I'm trying to find where the tiredness is. I don't know what it is. It's as much in that fence out there as it is here,
Right.
I guess.
Sure.
It's everywhere. And I don't know if I'm just sort of going, I don't think I'm going unconscious to it. I think that disappears somehow. I think it's a whole
course.
thing is topsy-turvy
Of course.
of how we think about it.
Of course. The only ontological absolute is your experience. In other words, there is no fence, there's just your experience. And if there's no fence in your experience, there's no fence.
So it disappears.
Of course.
I don't go anywhere.
Sure. I mean, you just look away and it disappears. Blink and it disappears. And there's no it, because the it that it is in any instant is already a different it in the next instant, depending on,
Right.
because your experience of it is different, so it is different because the only actuality is your experience of it, not an it.
I don't even know what tiredness is, actually.
Of course not. You can't know what anything is. Because, this is what I mean by transcendence. Everything is apparent, but if you try and pin down what it is, it opens to radiance. it's undeniably radiance. But having said that, you can't find what radiance is, so it's kind of begging the question.
It's almost like it's interesting because it's like a force. It's not like a. People think of it. I think of it normally as a lack of waning of force, of of exhaustion. It's like running out of gas. But it's more. It's actually an act of radiance.
Yeah, it's pulsating. Like the thing called tiredness.
But all experience is that. Experience is always a force. Wakefulness is a force. Clarity is a force.
Sleeping is a force.
Fuzzy-headedness is a force. Emotionality is a force. All these things are dynamic. This is the basic principle of the second branch of Kashmir Shaivism, the Spanda branch. That Spanda is this primal force, which shows up as all of these different modes that we characterize in such elaborate ways.
And confusion is a force.
Absolutely, of course it is. Clarity is a force.
I was just realizing, I was thinking of the reification. You were saying you change your focus, you look at this side of the room, that side of the room disappears. Well, reification means that side of the room doesn't disappear.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And
You create the fantasy of that is contrary to fact.
And that's like Atlas carrying the earth on his shoulders.
Yeah.
We're carrying this huge. That's why it's hard to be ignorant. It's
Oh,
hard
yeah.
work to be ignorant.
Oh, yeah.
We're Atlas carrying this huge world.
You have to carry your whole world. You have to carry your history. You have to carry your orientation. You have to carry your social relationship. You have to carry your social status. You have to carry your neuroses. You have to carry your inadequacies and your warped self-image. You have to carry all of these things.
As well as the effort to get
Carry is a euphemism for recreate in real time.
Yeah.
Very, very purposefully and actively. I mean, Jesus, what a lot of work.
That's correct.
But if that is a force, then we don't have to. That force.
Well, of course.
Itself.
Right. And when you see that, you're free of it, without needing to stop it or start it. When you see that that you're not doing the personality, that it is this primal force, the radiance is doing the personality, then you're free of the personality without it needing to cease.
So others can go on carrying the earth, but it's not me anymore.
Yeah. And this is the nature, the very essence of the nature of liberation from karma. You're liberated from karma not by your karma ceasing, but by it ceasing to be karma because it's just primal radiance.
That's a good word.
Which it always was. But you're noticing that fact is very powerful because you're no longer identifying yourself as the doer. You're not identifying yourself as having the obligation to maintain all these things. You let go of them, and whether or not they're maintained at that point becomes irrelevant. So everything, your entire karma could be completely as maintained as it ever was, but all of a sudden it's not your karma anymore. It's just the will of God. You're off the hook. you're out to pasture. So liberation is a very fascinating phenomena because you're liberated from everything without anything needing to be different or needing to cease in 20 degrees. Or not.
And yet there's some value in the representation of some of these ideas, like Dean was saying that it may take you don't need to spend the 20 years doing the practice to get there, and then there's the whole idea of the wheel of karma that has to run down, and in effect it's the recognition of and that all this has been an add-on, that in other words that you've been ignoring reality in favor of all this karma, all this stuff we call
interpretation,
karma, interpretation, thought space.
Yeah.
And so the symbolism is not too far off. There's a wearing down of it. It's kind of like the wheel.
It looks like that,
potter's
sure.
wheel, it looks like that.
I mean, you don't come to being free of your karma until you do,
right.
Which looks like an unfolding of your karma, even though you discover that there never was any karma.
There never was any.
Which is the ultimate unfolding of apparent unfolding of your karma. So the whole thing is very paradoxical and eludes analysis. But the very nature of what this is eludes analysis because, again, it's intrinsically transcendental, so of course it doesn't make any sense. Of course you can't find what it is. So we talk about it in these terms, but it's just heavy-handed shoehorning. And the reality is always elusive. The reality is always just slipping through our fingers somewhere beyond the discourse.
Because we're still making a dualism between samsara and nirvana.
Or just because we're still talking about anything as if there was anything that's differentiable at all, or indicatable at all, whereas in actual fact there is no findable condition, period, to talk about.
And as if the talking had any value and representation.
Even as all conditions are completely present, there is no findable actual condition. So it's a very strange state of affairs.
Go figure.
Go figure.
Also seems paradoxical because the sense of
Travel this way from LA just for this.
Really?
I'm retired.
Dude.
I came to satsang and I didn't even get this damn t-shirt. Where's the t-shirt? I want my t-shirt.
the sense of a doer feels really like heavy in a lot of ways, but also the sense that it's really nothing at all. Like Mr. Dante called it a little whorl. Like
Sure.
it just seems like, I mean, to me it just feels like it's heavy and in the way and like a big deal, but also at the same time I sense that it's floating in nothing. And it's
It's big because it carries your entire world, but it's nothing because in actual fact it is nothing, and there is no world.
Damn.
So it kind of depends on how you spin it. It depends on how you situate yourself with regard to it. Whatever, you can't say exactly what that means.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you can feel it.
Yeah.
It disappear.
Yeah. When you position yourself to a point where you see that it is nothing, then all of a sudden it is nothing, and it's no longer heavy. Without having changed it all.
You indicate that recognition for you was like looking at one of those pictures where all of a sudden you see the image or you see the writing.
Magic.
Whereas beforehand...
Yeah, kind of, you could say that, yeah.
You had beforehand you sort of have a sense cognitively and feeling and maybe even with your heart, but it's not a full-on recognition like looking at the wall and realizing and seeing that it's white.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Right,
Yeah.
sure.
I mean, so at times it seems like you're sort of actually getting someplace, if you will, because the things are starting to look less and less concrete and more sort of evaporative. But it doesn't last. Doesn't sort of always sort of stay with you. If you will, the non-reality keeps hooking.
Keep looking in that direction, right?
But
it's I'm thinking about The Godfather, where the guy says, he keeps sucking me back in. Do you remember that?
Yes.
But it's subtle because ultimately it's not about not getting sucked in. It's about seeing that getting sucked in is that too, and then at that point it stops mattering. So it's not a matter of finding a position where you're not sucked in. It's a matter of finding a position where you don't give a shit about being sucked in or not, because in is an in. When you're sucked in, you're right here. When you're not sucked in, you're right here. And what's the difference?
One sucks, the other one doesn't.
Peter, are you, when you talk about karma, is that the same thing as patterning?
Is what?
Karma is thinking that patterning is actual and that you are in it. And that you need to relate, you need to do something about it or relate to it in various ways. And for the purpose of this discussion.
So, at some point, when you are disengaged from the patterning, then is that what liberation is?
Liberation is when you see the patterning is not what you thought it was, it's not actually patterning, it has nothing to do with you whatsoever. And so it stops mattering what it is or where it is or whether it is. Because you have no need to orient to it one way or the other.
There'll be an experience of it, but not as owned or important.
No importance. There may or may not be apparent patterning, but there's no importance whatsoever. Yeah, karma as a problem is a sense that something is important, something matters.
Yeah.
It matters to do something, it matters to not do something, it matters to get something, it matters to not get something, it matters, something matters. in some sense. And freedom from karma, liberation, is the sense that nothing matters. There is nothing. There is no importance. There's no obligation. There's nothing that needs to be done or not done. There's no bias towards that whatsoever.
So that I mean, if there was any goal, that would be it as far as getting.
Sure, the goal is goallessness. But actually, more profoundly, the goal is the discovery of goallessness, because goallessness is in fact the actual condition. So it's easier than getting to goallessness. It's simply noticing goallessness.
At the core of it, I mean, at least for me, at the core of it though is this thing about death.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's the physical death, but it's that other death too. That death is even more terrifying than physical death. And that's the death that I'm no longer going to be existing.
Sure. But that's a fantasy.
Right. I mean, I heard that.
But you can see it, because try and find it. If it's an actuality, you should be able to find it in your actual experience in real time. If you can't find it in your experience in real time, then it's clearly a fantasy. In other words, you have to create it in real time because it's not present.
It's just such a habit.
No, I understand,
it's a
of course.
Tremendous habit.
Oh, I understand that,
It's
sure.
the worst kind of addiction.
It's a horrible double bind too, because there's also like a craving for annihilation potentially.
Well, as a means of liberation, but in fact, you know, we're learning that there really isn't any liberation. There's nothing to be liberated from or to, or it is. It's kind of a very core,
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. But, you know, instead of orienting towards things that are problems like death, my recommendation is orient towards positivity. Like you've heard me say over and over, go to the radiance, which is another way of just saying, be with what is actually and concretely present in your experience, without worrying about how you qualify it, whether you call it life or you call it whatever. Just be with that, and it's an actuality, it is present, and it ultimately dominates things that are not actualities, that are not present, i.e. all fantasies.
Right.
And it explains them too, ultimately, because it reveals by its very nature that all these fantasies are its spin-offs, and the spin-offs can't depart from the actual event. So if the fantasy of death exists, it's a spin-off of this radiance. So if you are with this radiance, you're finding out what death is. But you're being with it as a positivity, as an actuality, as not a cessation or a termination or something like that. You just be with actuality, and that alone is sufficient. And actuality will dominate, because actuality is sanity. It's real. It's undeniable, and it's more powerful than fantasy. It just simply is. And the more we find the lusciousness and the richness. I mean, this actuality is not just neutral. It's incredibly positive. I mean, it's rewarding. It's interesting. It's fulfilling. It's nourishing. It's endlessly entertaining. It's funny. It's stimulating. I mean, it's just a complete win just to be with this actuality as it is. You're plugging into something that is just like, oh yeah, baby, give me more. And so by being in this positivity, it overshadows all of this ghostly issues that we grapple with. And ultimately it reveals the way in which it includes them. And all of these apparent issues are just misunderstandings of this basic positivity.
I like what you said about allowing it to dominate.
Yeah.
I think that's a good way to...
Yeah, you don't even need to allow it to dominate. If you notice it, it will dominate, because it is dominant. It is unsurpassing. It is the dominant positivity. It trumps everything. It's the trump suit. And because it's real and actual, it of course intrinsically trumps things that are less real and less actual, like fantasy and so on.
Because it is what there is.
It's what there is. It's undeniable. It's not something you need to. It doesn't depend upon faith or assertion or effort on your part. It does all the work. It's self-verifying. And ultimately, you will, by being with the radiance, you will come to understand death, because radiance teaches and shows undeniably that all conditions of experience whatsoever consist of this radiance. So when you're on your deathbed, it's going to be the presence of the radiance. And when you're actually dying, it's going to be the presence of the radiance. It has to be, because there's nothing else that it could be. And the radiance will show you that, so death will just be another positive orientation to radiance, just like life is, just like, being at work in a different, challenging job is actually this dynamic, luscious radiance. Being in an extremely pleasurable experience is this dynamic, positive radiance. There's nothing but. And when you become sensitive, when you begin to orient more towards the substance of experience, i.e. the radiance, and less towards your defined circumstantial interpretation of experience, i.e. your storylines and narrations of what's going on, this will intrinsically reorient your whole sense of empowerment, your whole sense of value, your whole sense of importance. And, most profoundly, just inconceivably profoundly. And you'll discover that all of these definitions are really trivial and unreal and unimportant relative to this incredible positivity that the radiance intrinsically is. Ultimately including even sickness, death, pain, failure, all these kinds of things turn out to be complete absurd trivialities in the face of this, the actuality of the actual positivity of this radiance, this experience, the being of this experience, the positive being of this experience is, it's powerful. It's intrinsically powerful. That's, I couched that in terms of the yoga radiant presence at the retreat, and this is what I'm talking about. And it's literally, it's the panacea. It's just the complete panacea. It solves all problems and explains all confusion and liberates from all entanglements and blah 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 blah. It's really one size fits all. But in that, and it self-verifyingly reveals that. It doesn't depend on my assertion that that's so. It will do that of its own. It communicates that. It conveys that. It convinces that, because it's its very nature that's how it is. That's what it does. It can't not do that.
And by going to keep on that similar vein, the radiance. It's literally light, but it's also like the dynamism of all appearance. So it's actually more a verb, a dynamism of appearing constantly. Like you said, that things are just replenishing themselves instantaneously.
Yeah.
And that's the death right there. So that's because you always said that you can see. So you're reading the coffee grounds or the chai grounds. That the whole is always in all the parts. So even right now, the hole's here. So death is right. We're looking at it right now. It's doing this. It's living and dying, and it's
exactly.
So that's how you get used. You're already used to it, I guess.
Totally used to it. It's just a matter. Again, I coined this term noticing, and it seems really applicable. You're noticing what is already the case. You're noticing what you're already expert at. You're noticing what you've always been doing all this whole time. So it's very paradoxical to be pay attention to what you've always been paying attention to. How hard can that be?
I think I asked you once in an email about when I started seeing things flashing, it made me think, well, maybe I'm looking form is emptiness. Oh, that's what that means. Maybe I'm actually looking at I'm here and I'm not here.
Sure, of course.
Kind of at the same.
Because here-ness turns out to be a qualification of radiance, and not here-ness is a totally valid qualification of radiance, because radiance is transcendent. You can't find it. It's completely explicit and obviously present, but you can't find it. So it's certainly here and not here. it's here, but then you go looking for here and you can't find here. So here is not here. Everything is here, but you can't find here, so here is not here. I mean, in other words, it's always strange. It's always beyond any way of classifying it as being this or that.
Yeah, I was looking more in terms of the flashing as opposed to the whole feeling of hearing.
It's one and the same.
Okay.
It's one and the same. The flashing is just seeing this and seeing that and seeing this and seeing that, versus more of a sort of a steady state. But neither of those is actual. Both of those is more in how it's presenting, how you're engaging with it.
Huh.
Anyway, it's about quitting time, so good night, online people.
The flashy stuff.